Hello, everybody. For the last 5 weeks before the exam, you were looking at we were studying the history of Europe and focusing on Europe and the Near East, including the Ottoman Empire. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at what was happening at the same time. That would be from about 1500 to the 18th century. Look at what was going on in East and South Asia uh, during the early modern era over in Europe and Western Asia. So we're going to begin with China. And now, when looking at this period, people or historians traditionally refer to it as the late traditional period. Those terms, late traditional, that refers to the fact that in this period there was a great emphasis on continuity and a great emphasis on preserving tradition, preserving the past. So whereas you see great rapid change going on to the west in Europe, in China especially, the emphasis was always on tradition and continuity. And just to give you an idea of this continuity, from the period from the 14th century all the way through the 20th century, or the beginning of the 20th century, China was just ruled by two dynasties or two imperial families, the Ming from 1368 to 1644, and then the Qing or Manchu dynasty from 1644 to 1911. And today we're only going to be looking at the Qing dynasty through the 18th century. So let's begin with the Ming dynasty. So you can see here a map of the Ming dynasty, and the Ming dynasty replaced the Yuan dynasty or the Mongol dynasty that had preceded it. And a factor in this changeover was what historians or Chinese historians refer to as the Mandate of Heaven. The 13th century was a time when, or the 14th century, the 1300s, was a time when the world was going through climate change. The Little Ice Age was kicking in, and China was experiencing flooding and crop failures. And at the same time, the reigning Mongol dynasty was having problems maintaining order, and there were civil wars and power struggles. And many of the people of China, many people in China, believed that the reigning dynasty, the Mongol dynasty, had lost the mandate of heaven. That is, they no longer had the blessing of the gods. In traditional Chinese worldview, the heavens are inhabited by the gods, and their designated representative is the emperor, the son of heaven, as he's known. And if the emperor is true and the emperor is real, then there should be peace, prosperity for all the people of China. So when times are tough and the economy is not doing well and there's natural disasters and wars, the people of China come to believe that the dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven, has lost the blessing of heaven, and therefore is no longer legitimate. And so that in these periods that leads to uprisings and rebellions. And in the 14th century, there was a great uprising led by a man named Hong Wu. And, well, that was his throne name. He took that name once he became emperor. Before that, he was a rebel leader, a person who grew up in a Buddhist monastery, who led a cult of Buddhist followers, the White Lotus cult. And that was the basis of a rebel army that eventually overthrew the Yuan or Mongol dynasty and came to power. And upon coming to power, he proclaimed himself great military leader, or Hong Wu, and ruled over China with an iron fist. And now, once he became ruler, though, he kind of pushed aside his former Buddhist followers and proclaimed himself a devout Confucianist, which was the traditional religion and ideology of the Chinese state. And that way, he won the support of the Chunzi, the traditional gentleman, the scholar gentleman of that made up the Chinese elite in this time period. Now, Hongwu declared himself the founder of the brilliant or Ming Dynasty, and what we see under his successors is a phenomenon that Chinese historians refer to as the dynastic cycle. In the dynastic cycle, a dynasty of rulers starts out strong with effective and hardworking rulers such as Hongwu, who rule China well, and everybody seems to be prospering. But then, as generation follows generation, the later generations tend to be not as competent and more interested in seeking pleasure or their own personal fulfillment rather than running China. And under the Ming Dynasty, there had been a great concentration of power in the upper ranks of the bureaucracy. And so when these Ming rulers at the top were less effective, that meant that the central government was less effective and weak and incompetent. And that led to a situation that by the 17th century led to disorder. Just as the Mongol dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven in the 17th century, the Ming dynasty also lost the mandate of heaven. Now, in this case, what happened is that China was invaded by the Manchu peoples, or the Jurgen, or Manchu. Now, the Manchu were a people, they weren't Chinese, they even spoke a different language that belonged to a different language group than Chinese, but their original home was up here in the northeast, in what is still known as Manchuria. That's where we get Manchu, Manchuria. And now this is another theme, another repeat of history in the sense that this was not the first time that a northern steppe people had conquered China. In fact, that's what had happened centuries earlier. The Mongols were originally from the steppes of Asia, who had marched south and conquered China, and now it's the Manchurians, the Manchu, who invaded China as China was experiencing great distress and wars and rebellions. The Manchu came in and conquered China, but the Manchu had lived in proximity to China long enough that they had adopted Chinese culture. And when they took over China, Beijing had been the original capital under the Mongol dynasty, had continued to be the capital under the Ming, and now when the Manchu took over in the 17th century, they also maintained Beijing as their capital. And the Forbidden City, the great palace of the emperors that was located in Beijing, it had been built by the Ming dynasty, but it continued to be the residence of the reigning Manchu or Qing dynasty ruler once they came to power and took over China. And just as Hongwu had declared himself a Confucianist and a patron of Confucian scholars, in this new dynasty under the Manchurian dynasty, Kangxi, who was one of its long-lasting and greatest emperors, Kangxi also declared himself to be a great Confucianist. In fact, he had posted throughout the empire the teachings of Confucius, so that all the Chinese people could see them. So here again we see a people who are not Chinese but adopting Chinese culture and ruling over China. And this had happened before in Chinese history, like in the case of the Mongols back in the 13th century. So that was the Qing dynasty, and China under the Qing dynasty continued to prosper. The 18th century was a period of population growth. Trade with European merchants brought large sums of gold and silver that was used as currency throughout China. So the 18th century was a time of great prosperity under Kangxi and his grandson, who ruled through most of the 18th century. So that's China. So to the off the coast of China, to its east, in the Pacific Ocean, we see the islands of Japan. And in Japan, we see a similar story in the sense that we have longevity and continuity. The Tokugawa shogunate was established in 1600 and would establish peace and prosperity and order for Japan for nearly 300 years, all the way until the mid-19th century. So let's talk a little bit about Japan. Now, in Japan, the Japanese islands were ruled by various warlords or local lords who each had their army of loyal warriors or samurai warriors. And at the top of this pyramid of feudal lords was the shogun or great warlord. And all the lords were supposed to be loyal to the shogun. Now, in Japan, the shogun was the actual military leader of Japan, but in theory, the ruler of Japan was the emperor, the Japanese emperor, who was revered as a god. He was descended from the sun goddess, but the emperor had no real power. They were a religious leader. They performed Shinto cults, the Shinto rituals that was the traditional religion of Japan. So the emperors existed. There was a whole line of emperors that went all the way back to the 7th century AD. But these emperors were devoid of any real political power and basically held a ceremonial position. But the Japanese were loyal to the emperor, and that kept a sense of unity in Japan. But when we start looking at Japan in this period, in the 15th century, Japan was ruled by a dynasty of shoguns, the Ashikaga shogunate. These were shoguns from the Ashikaga family. And in the 15th century, many of the great lords of Japan, the great landlords, the great warrior chieftains, they viewed this shogunate as weak and ineffective. And in 1467, what began was the era of warring states, where all these different states were waging war against each other. Each feudal lord, each lord trying to become shogun. Now, eventually, a man by the name of Tokugawa, around 1600, ended over a century of war, of civil war, and he was able to establish a permanent, stable regime, and his descendants ruled as shoguns for nearly 300 years. Now, how did he do that? Well, one of the things that happened under the Tokugawa shogunate was that Japan kind of closed itself off from the world. They believed that many of the civil wars were due to the fact that many of the warlords were importing guns and materials from different European traders and then using those materials and those resources to wage war. So Tokugawa figured that if you just closed off the borders and didn't allow trade with any European powers or with anybody except for maybe China, then there would be no guns or no supplies that might lead to civil war or rebellions by upstart warlords. So another thing he did was he limited the number of samurai. So there were only just a limited number of warriors assigned to each feudal lord. And he also made it illegal for feudal lords to build fortresses without his approval. So he also made sure that every one of the daimyo, or the great feudal lords, they all had to send their sons to the court of the shogun to basically serve as hostages to keep the peace. And these reforms that were made by Tokugawa were so effective that they did provide Japan with a great deal of prosperity and peace for nearly 300 years. And the samurai during this time period went from being warriors, trained warriors, to, since there was no wars to fight, they became largely bureaucrats and officials, and they adopted much of the persona of the traditional Chinese scholar gentleman, except they still maintained their warrior training as a part of their kind of heritage. So here again we see in Japan, this, like we saw in China, this real emphasis on the traditions of the past. So these samurai were no longer active warriors, but they still maintained their traditions as warriors, even though they're basically serving as bureaucrats and officials in the various states of the daimyo of these great feudal lords. All right, so now that we've talked about China, we've talked about Japan, I want to talk about what was going on in India and in South Asia at this time. And here again in India, we see a lot of history repeating itself and a lot of tradition and preservation of tradition. Now, in the case of India, one of the things we see in Indian history a lot is where people from the steppes of Asia cross the Hindu Kush Mountains into the Indian subcontinent. This had happened from the very dawn of Indian history with the Aryan invaders of the 1615, 1400 BC migrations. Now, in the 16th century, the steppe nomads that invaded India were the Chagatai Turkoman, led by a man, a Khan, that's what you call Mongol warlords, a Khan, named Babur. Now, Babur was descended from Genghis Khan, the great Mongol conqueror. And in fact, that's where we get the word Mughal to describe the empire that Babur founded. Well, Babur was the commander or the Khan or leader of the Chagatai Turkoman. And what happened is he, in the steppes of Asia, lost in a war against the Uzbeks. The Uzbeks being another Turkish people who lived in what is today Uzbekistan. And upon losing to the Uzbeks, he decided to march his Turkoman south, and they invaded what is today Pakistan and India. Now, when they got there, there had been the leading state in northern India was the Sultanate of Delhi. Here's Delhi here in central India. And they in fact were descended from Turks and Afghans who had invaded India back in the beginning of the 13th century. So they'd been around for 300 years. So in 1526, these people faced a new invader. Now that would be Babur and the Chagatai Turkoman. And in 1526, he defeated the Sultan of Delhi, captured Delhi and made it his new capital and created a new state. Now, he was a descendant of Genghis Khan, so he was a Mongol. Now, when he took over this empire, you see, Turkish wasn't a respected literary language. So he decided to adopt Persian as his language of his government. And the Persian word for Mongol is Mughal. That's where we get the term Mughal. And for a very long period, Persian, which is an Iranian language, was actually the official language of the state. And Babur himself adopted the title of Shah, which is the Persian word for king. So it's a very interesting situation where you have a Turkoman, a Turk, adopting a Persian title and ruling over a population that was predominantly Hindu, who weren't even Muslim. Babur was a Muslim, but the vast majority of his citizens were Hindu, did not practice Islam. Now, there had been the Delhi Sultanate that preceded the Mughal dynasty. They were a Muslim state as well, and it was the tradition that non-Muslims, the Hindus, had to pay a very heavy poll tax called a jizra, and they also were required to pay a tax whenever they went on a pilgrimage. And the purpose of this tax, the purpose of these taxes, were to give the Hindus an incentive to convert to Islam, because if they converted to Islam, they wouldn't have to pay the tax. And you see, Islam directly forbids forced conversion. So they didn't want to convert Hindus by force to become Muslims, but they used these taxes as a way to try to get Hindus to convert. And in fact, millions of them did. In fact, to this day, India has millions of Muslims who are still living there. They're still a minority because there's still more Hindus than Muslims, but they're still there. Now, one of the greatest rulers of the Mughal dynasty was Akbar. Akbar was a descendant from Babur, and the thing about Akbar was that he wanted to be the ruler of all people of India. So even though he was a Muslim, he decided to end the poll tax and to allow Hindus to practice their faith freely, to build temples. They had been forbidden to build new temples under previous rulers, but now they're allowed to build or rebuild their temples. And to this day, he's considered to be, even by Hindu Indians, to be a great Indian ruler. Now, another descendant of him named Aurangzeb, 1658 to 1705, he kind of reversed the policies of Akbar. He decided to reimpose the poll tax on Hindus, and he forbid the construction of Hindu temples. And he also wanted to fight the jihad. He wanted to wage war on non-practicing Muslims and Hindus. So he vastly expanded the size of the empire. But these wars turned out to be very, very expensive. And also he faced continuous uprisings by the native Hindus because of this reimposition of these taxes. Now, in the end, upon his death, India was bankrupt and fragmented by many years of war. And in fact, in 1739, the ruler of Persia even sacked Delhi, and that was a big blow to the prestige of the Mughal dynasty. And what happened is that many of the local governors, the Nawabs, as they were called, became more independent and became independent rulers. So we see the kind of the breakup of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century. And to fill that void came the British East India Company. The British East India Company had been established by Queen Elizabeth back in 1601, and they had a monopoly of all trade between India and the British Empire. And they established a series of outposts, like at Bombay and at Madras, and they were basically at first interested in trade. But what they did is they would recruit Muslims and Hindus to serve as a mercenary army for the British East India Company, and they were known as sepoys. And these sepoys were provided with European guns and weapons and trained by British officers, and they became the military arm of the British East India Company. And the British East India Company used these armies as ways to force local Nawabs and officials of the Mughal dynasty to make lucrative deals, lucrative to the British East India Company. Now, eventually, the British East India Company had a rival with the French East India Company that was also trying to advance its own interest in the Indian subcontinent. And during the 7 Years' War, the British and their Indian allies waged war against the French and their Indian allies. And in the end, the British were able to defeat the French, and the British East India Company established itself as the dominant power in India by the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. So really, by the late 18th century, you still had a Mughal dynasty that still existed and was fragmented into all these different small states ruled by provincial lords. But the real power in India was the British East India Company. All right, so finally, we're going to be talking about another empire in Iran. And now the Mughal dynasty and the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Safavid Empire, are often known as the as gunpowder empires. Why is that? Because these are both empires that were created by armies armed with guns and cannon. And this is the first time in history that we see this coming into play. So that's where we get the term gunpowder empire. Now the Safavids have their origins in a religious mystic by the name of Safi the Sufi. A Sufi is a religious mystic who has visions of God, and this Safi lived about here, just on the south shore of the Caspian Sea in what is today northern Iran. And he had such a holy reputation that he attracted the loyalty of local Turkish holy warriors, or Ghazis. Now, when we looked at when we studied the history of the Ottoman Empire, these holy warriors, these Turkish holy warriors, they were the ones who also fought for the jihad for the Ottoman Sultan. But in this case, we see Ghazis fighting as loyal warriors for Safi, the holy man. Now, the descendant of Safi was Ismail. You can see his dates there. He came to the throne in 1501, and he led his Turkish soldiers armed with guns and cannon, and they basically created an empire that is roughly what is today Iran and Afghanistan. So it was a very vastly multi-ethnic empire. It included various Iranian peoples as well as Arabs and Turks. But when he conquered this empire, he divided it up among his various Turkish warlords who had followed him into battle. Now, Ismail founded a dynasty of Shahs. Now, Persian was the language of their court. Persian was the language of their dynasty, and they used the word Shah to describe themselves because that's the Persian word for king, just like they use Shah over in Mughal India. Now, the greatest Shah of the Safavid dynasty was Abbas the Great. You can see his dates up there. So he would have been roughly a contemporary of Akbar and Elizabeth and Philip II over in Spain and England. Now, the thing about the Safavid Empire was that Iran is a large country. Here you can see the different gunpowder empires, but it's a fairly large region, and it was hard for a single dynasty to rule over such an extensive area. And so eventually, by the 18th century, you had a situation where the empire was fragmented and you had different warlords waging war against each other. Now, early on, a man by the name of Nader Shah, who was actually from Afghanistan, from Western Afghanistan, he actually, for a brief period, conquered all of Iran, the whole region. He was the same person who in 1739 marched his armies and plundered Delhi, the capital of the Mughal Empire. So he was one of the last great military minds of Asia in the 18th century. Now, he wasn't able to establish a dynasty, and after his death in 1749, once again the region fell into war. Now, there was a man by the name of Agha Muhammad who lived in what is today eastern Iran, and he was descended from the Turkish warlords who had followed Ismail and conquered Iran back at the beginning of the 16th century. And Agha Muhammad lived at a time of constant warfare, and he had a tough life. You know, when he was 8 years old, he was castrated. His enemies, the enemies of his family, captured him, and they castrated him. But he kept on fighting, and eventually he was able to establish himself and unite all of Iran. And obviously he couldn't have children, so he kind of adopted his nephew, Fath Ali Shah. And when Agha Muhammad was assassinated, his nephew, Fath Ali Shah, established a dynasty of Shahs that ruled over Iran all the way up until the early part of the 20th century. And they're known as the Qajar dynasty because that was the name of the family of Agha Muhammad, the clan. And one way that they maintained stability over their large empire was that they retained the highest positions in the government for members of their own family, the Qajar family. So there was the unity of the family was a factor in allowing the empire to maintain some stability. Another thing they did was that by this time, Iran was fully Shiite Muslim, and in Islam, you don't have priests, you don't have clergy, but you do have Islamic scholars who are experts in Islamic or Sharia law, and it's often a hereditary position. So sons follow their fathers as clerics, and collectively, these scholars are known as the ulama. And one of the things the Qajar dynasty did was that they made sure that at the local level they won the support of the Shiite ulama, the Shiite scholars. And so these Shiite scholars, these ulama, at the local level, they were widely respected by the general population, and they fully supported the Qajar dynasty and was a factor in the success of this dynasty over the decades in Iran. All right, so that is a rough overview of broad overview of all the different states in late traditional Asia from the year 1500 through the 18th century. So that's it for now.